I actually think that's more of what we assume he should want, because we all see what a nightmare the Colts have become. And this is a real shame. It's a real shame. And it reminds me of the late 80s, early 90s of Dan Marino in Miami. Dan Marino still has effective Don Shula in the mid-80s. And he still has a semblance of a good defense, the Killer Bees, that had gone to the Super Bowl in 1982 with David Woodley and Don Strock, and then kind of carried over still the Killer Bees into 1984, which was the only time Marino would get to the Super Bowl. He gets to an AFC Championship game in 1985. They lose to the Cinderella Patriots. Essentially, Dan Marino never gets back close enough to sniff a Super Bowl until 7 years later. They totally mess up Dan Marino's 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. They finally get back to the playoffs in 90. They missed the playoffs for 4 straight years in Marino's prime. They missed the playoffs. Not that they didn't win the division, not that they didn't go to the Super Bowl. They missed the playoffs in 86, 87, 88, and 89, which is unheard of when you have Marino in his prime. He's in his late 20s, mid to late 20s at that point. What happened? Don Shula's personnel decisions became worse and worse. His effectiveness as a coach started to wane. And they just drafted poorly. They could never assemble a decent defense around Marino. They could never assemble a decent ground game around Marino. And there was no help. There was no help. And I kind of feel like Andrew Luck is now in the middle of his own Dan Marino moment, where early in his career it seemed inevitable. That guy's going to win a Super Bowl. That guy is doing all the things to win a Super Bowl. This team is close already. Remember, they played an AFC Championship game 2 years ago. That was the Deflategate game. They'd gone to the playoffs 3 straight years, a wild card win, then a divisional win. They had gotten through a level higher every year. And then last year they fell off the map. And this year, what has happened to Luck and the organization in the offseason is ugly. I think he had his body beaten to bloody pulp because of a terrible offensive line, which is Ryan Grigson's total professional negligence. I mean, he just did not think it was important enough, I guess. And also did not draft well at all. I mean, look at Philip Dorsett. Philip Dorsett was brought in to be another deep threat for Andrew Luck as a first-round draft pick. Philip Dorsett was this typifies everything that's broken with the Colts. They drafted poorly, so Philip Dorsett was a bust. 2 years later, they trade the bust for a third-string quarterback because they have no answer when Andrew Luck was out because he got beaten up behind a terrible offensive line. It was like they turned a commodity, a first-round draft pick, into a third-string quarterback. That's how bad this whole thing has become because they were so desperate. Like, you could have acquired somebody as good as Jacoby Brissett in the offseason. We know this. And you wouldn't have had to have traded a first-round draft pick, except it didn't really matter because that first-round draft pick was a bust. I think that right now we assume that Luck would want out because Pagano seems in over his head. The owner has now a shotgun marriage between the coach and the GM. The last GM was a nightmare, and the offensive line still isn't fixed, and now the Colts really don't have much talent. They really don't. I mean, outside of T.Y. Hilton, there is very few acquisitions that this organization has made over the last 5 years that look like they're even good, let alone great. We assume Luck wants out, but I actually believe his agent when he says these are false, because I'm not certain Luck would ever even vocalize that because he seems to always want to do the right thing.